We are not a zone of peace. My country hasn't been a zone of peace since late 1980s. Instead of blame, can you have a more compassionate approach? The tourism sector is not making our countries better off, because if it was, we would all be Dubai. Which country do you know has done an economic impact study of the tourism sector? No country in the Caribbean.
The free movement agreement that came into effect October 1 between Barbados, Belize, Dominica, and St. Vincent, four CARICOM nations. What do you think it signals for the future of economic integration for the region?
This is a question, I guess, that was on everybody's mind at the time. When you look at the demographic trajectory of the Caribbean, there are only 6 countries that haven't seen their populations peak as yet. So it means all of us are at that point of population decline. It means that we have issues on the horizon of satisfying the demand for skilled labor in our countries. So that's the first point I want to make. The second thing is this free movement of labor was contemplated way back, and it's part of the CSME agenda. And Barbados is the country in CARICOM that's sort of responsible for this CSME integration. So after many years of very little happening as it regards to free movement, we're seeing a lot more taking place. A few years ago, CARICOM approved this reform where they agreed that instead of everybody having to agree unanimously on anything that they're going to do, once you have a certain amount of countries agreeing to move forward with something, they can go right ahead. So in other words, CARICOM itself made room for member states who are aligned to go ahead with whatever reform they decide they want to do. If the others don't want to join, that's fine. And so you might recall that Guyana, Trinidad, I think Grenada and Barbados had agreed a couple years ago on this whole idea around food security. That food security initiative was, again, a few countries coming together, not the whole collective. And this is another example of a few countries agreeing to do something whilst the rest are making up their minds, I guess. So all of these reforms, I think, are part and parcel of CARICOM functioning the way I guess it was always intended to function and the things that it was intended to do. So I am not entirely surprised at all.
It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming. And the thing is, poor CARICOM, right? When it does nothing, people criticize. When it does something, people criticize. And it's like, they can't win. When I saw this, I'm like, good for them. They decided to do something that, from a policy perspective, they felt they needed. Certainly, Barbados has been seeing declining population for a while in terms of its birth rate being below the replacement rate. And so this free movement is something that I think is a responsible move if you're looking to address a shortfall in your supply for skilled labor relative to the demand.
It made sense for Barbados. I was curious about Belize. I have to say that surprised me a little bit.
I'm not as familiar with Belize, so I am not sure if they have a skilled labor shortage that they're trying to address, but certainly Jamaica did up until very recently. The other thing is, it's not even just about the total amount of skilled labor, it's what kind of skilled labor.
Let's talk about who really benefits from free movement in terms of the actual people. I mean, we live in a time of cost of living crises, climate crises. It seems to be more of a privilege of the few. Can you really up and move when you've lost everything, as we've seen, tragically in Jamaica, which we'll get to in a second?
In the absence of the free movement agreement, nobody has the option. At least these countries that have agreed to embark on free cross-border movement amongst its citizens. By the way, it's skilled labor, right? To answer your question, automatically there is some exclusivity to it, obviously, right? But at least the option is there, and that's something to celebrate. Whereas before, the option was not there. Becoming climate refugees is a reality for many people in many countries, and I think that that's a separate issue versus, the whole free movement of skilled labor. I think the rise of climate refugees globally is a separate problem, and it is a problem that we face in the Caribbean, but we don't necessarily talk about it, and we don't necessarily call it that.
No, we don't. Maybe it's also kind of a regional beginning of a realignment, do you think? I mean, we've got the America First policy, and it seems like every region is sort of rethinking how they approach commerce and everything else. And Trinidad and Tobago also recently said they were realigning, finding new partners, which kind of created a bit of a buzz.
Yeah, I think, look, there is a lot happening globally that we have no control over in the Caribbean. We can only control and influence what's in front of us in our domestic and to a certain extent regional space. And so I guess these countries decided to take control of that demographic problem that they're having, and kudos to them. With respect to realignment politically, it's interesting that Trinidad and Tobago got the kind of hate, I would say, that it got for aligning with the US. When you have a choice to make, do you align with Maduro, who is illegitimate? He did not win the last election legitimately from all official accounts outside of his government's accounts, right, in terms of international observers, etc., versus another government that has, first of all, it's one of your major trading partners, one of your major foreign direct investors. I mean, come on, guys. There's ideology, and then there's what's practical and pragmatism. And my prime minister chose, I would imagine, what's practical. I think she made the right choice. The fact is, we have a problem in Trinidad with narco trafficking, with crime. When we had an election campaign earlier this year, the two topics that were at the forefront, that were the most widely and hotly debated, was the crime situation and the foreign exchange situation. You have a prime minister that has decided, you know what, this is a problem that I cannot manage on my own. I don't have the firepower. I don't have the intelligence. There was an article many years ago that said that there are more guns in the hands of private citizens in Trinidad and Tobago versus the protective services, based on the gangs being well armed. We had a 1990 insurrection, I'm sure you're aware, where those insurrectionists were trained and armed by Libya. We have a long history of foreign intervention and arming and training of, I would use the word terrorists or criminals. And so if, we hadn't been able to deal with this problem since the 1980s, our homicide rate is going up every year. Why are you so against the prime minister deciding, you know what, I'm going to try a different approach? I really am confused by the pushback.
Sure. I mean, it's kind of looking out for the interests of your people rather than...
Well, exactly.
And what he was elected for, I suppose.
Well, exactly. That is why we elect them, to make our lives better. When the US invaded Grenada, people forget. Who was the country from which that invasion was staged? Barbados. Did you see the relationship between Grenada and Barbados fall apart? Does anybody hold anything against Barbados now? At that moment, you have to make a decision about what is right for your country and your people. And again, ideology versus pragmatism. What is practically necessary and prudent at this point versus this ideology of, we are a zone of peace. Zone of peace, what? You see the homicide rate in Trinidad and Tobago? Barbados has the fastest rising homicide rate in the Caribbean. So this zone of peace nonsense, honestly, really? We have in the Caribbean, we have some of the highest homicide rates in the world. Venezuela certainly has, if not the highest, one of the highest homicide rates in the world. So this zone of peace, give me a break. We are not a zone of peace. My country hasn't been a zone of peace since late 1980s.
But people don't like to hear that,
Of course they don't like to hear that, but it's the facts. It's the facts.
Before we dig into short memories, especially related to superstorms, the whole climate justice issue, Hurricane Melissa, as you know, exposed again the fragility of island economies with this worsening climate crisis. Your latest newsletter also addresses this, that there's a lack of accountability. The world's worst polluters are getting away with this. Everyone's is kind of spewing out this, climate justice, but then there's nothing happening behind it. You said it's time to try a different approach.
Yeah.
What does that different approach look like for small island developing states and getting climate funds?
The thing is, I wouldn't say there's nothing happening. I mean, clearly there's been funding that was put forward by many countries. There's been progress towards, like with Jamaica, they had this catastrophe bond that they were able to draw down on, and it provided some instant liquidity. They had access to some savings that they put aside in their resilience fund. They had access to the CRIF, the Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, which, by the way, gave Jamaica its largest payout ever following Hurricane Melissa. So there are things that have happened, and there are things happening. I mean, everybody's in COP30 in Brazil right now, and the fight is always, we need more funding, and countries make promises that they don't deliver fully on in terms of how much they promise to devote, right? They do some funding, but not the full extent to which they've made promises. So there is some action taking place, just not enough. Now, I feel like the momentum that has been created and the amount of energy that has been spent on advocating for climate justice reached a pitch with the ICJ's opinion that was published earlier this year. That was a historic, very, very much historic opinion published by the ICJ, which, by the way, was initiated by some students in Vanuatu. Right. And then their government took it to the ICJ. And the ICJ basically said that countries have responsibilities as it relates to the planet, and that countries have to demonstrate that they are working towards reducing their carbon emissions, that they have a plan in place, that they are taking action, and that they are collaborating in good faith. There's a whole, I wrote about it a couple of months ago. This was a big piece of action that the ICJ undertook with its opinion earlier this year. So that gives a platform for countries to say, you know what, I think this country is not doing enough, or that country is not doing enough. They promised X and they delivered Y. There's room now for countries to be taken to the ICJ, to be held accountable for them not doing what the ICJ has opined we all should be doing. So that's the first thing. That's a powerful mechanism or avenue that we didn't have before this ruling earlier this year. Now, the whole idea of climate justice is basically, I did not cause this problem, you did, therefore you have to pay for the damage. That's in a nutshell, right?
Yeah, in a nutshell.
I am not sure, especially in this geopolitical climate, where we have strong men who are popular, right? Let's not forget that. President Trump, for all of the criticism one can level at him, he won his election. So he represents the views of the majority of his people. And if you believe in democracy, you have to say, okay, this guy, he's what his people wanted. Whether they have buyer's remorse now is, that's a different matter. So we have people like him and others like him globally who are very powerful. They are not the kind of personality that you will get very far with if you say, you caused this problem, therefore you owe me. When you think about it.
I believe in the climate crisis.
They don't. Well, they don't. And that's another matter, because there is compelling evidence that this is also a natural phenomenon. The ICJ, in their ruling, said that they are of the view that the extent of the climate change we're seeing is man-made, but there is compelling evidence that nature itself changes all the time, and that a part of this is natural, okay? I am just saying that instead of trying to point fingers, level blame at people who you will just get nowhere with that type of argument, maybe what we need to do, and being emotionally intelligent and understanding the individuals that we are dealing with right now, maybe it is better to say, can you have a more compassionate approach as opposed to antagonistic approach, and say, we have a crisis. Jamaica's just been hit with the most powerful hurricane to ever make landfall in the Atlantic. Jamaica has about 30,000 people who are in shelters, who are homeless. 30-something people already died as a result of the hurricane, but there are many people still unaccounted for. Right. Yeah. Jamaica's Prime Minister announced that damages could run between 6 and 7 billion US dollars, but that's an initial estimate. It couldn't be. I don't want to misquote, but it could be the UN. that looked at maybe a 20 billion figure. Yet all of the sources of financing, including domestic sources of financing, gave Jamaica less than 1 billion. So you have a hole right now of 6 billion initially that needs to be funded. If the approach of trying to hold a big stick and say, you are the cause of this, you need to pay me, that hasn't worked. And it hasn't across administrations. Then let's possibly say, you know what, we need help. We have $6 billion of damage that we can't afford to fund. Jamaica came from 150 debt to GDP in 2011 to just about 60% earlier this year, just under 60%. They were, I think by the end of this year, they were scheduled to reach 58%. Jamaica cannot afford to take on this level of debt again. People in Jamaica have been undergoing over a decade of fiscal adjustments that has gotten them to a point where they were getting credit rating upgrade after upgrade because they were doing so well. And now this, it is not fair for Jamaica to have to borrow to fill that gap, right? I'm saying, appeal to compassion because, and as I outlined in my monthly report that you cited, the United States is the largest donor of international overseas development assistance. Perhaps what we need to do is have a serious conversation around maybe some of that development assistance we can repurpose, reconfigure, and maybe pay for more insurance at CRIF, for example, bigger catastrophe bond liquidity, and not access to finance that requires borrowing, but which is actually, aid, but aid that looks at recovery and adaptation to withstand a category 5 in the future.
Thank you for explaining that. What I wanted to ask you is, especially with the catastrophe bond, which I believe is the first time they've used this mechanism, right? But when I really think about it, you're essentially insuring yourself against what you're betting is going to be your island being destroyed. And I get it's an insurance mechanism, but can we do it before? Can we think about the before? Rather than coming in after and saying, well, I do have the money to fix everything, because we all know that's not going to be instant.
No. Now, the before is about climate adaptation. When we have to build roads, schools, hospitals, we need to build them with a code that ensures that they can withstand category 5. That means we have to rebuild our whole countries. That requires massive funding and a lot of labor, capital, and capacity to rebuild that many of us don't have. There are governments across the Caribbean, mine included, that every year they have a capital budget that they don't execute because they lack the capacity. Because remember, you have to put out RFPs, you have to get proposals in, you have to, it's a process.
Bureaucracy behind
Bureaucracy is a process, construction is a process, importing the material is a process, importing the labor, getting the labor permits. All of these things are a process. And so it is easy to talk about rebuilding, building back better, and rebuilding and climate adaptation. But many countries lack the capacity to even execute their own domestic capital budget that the finance minister reads to parliament when on budget day, let alone a capital or reconstruction program after hurricane hits. The amount of labor and technical expertise it requires is a level that countries don't have.
Maybe what you call climate compassion, which you just explained a little while ago, is a way to come in with that before. Can we avoid being in this situation again? Can you help us?
Well, again, certainly anything that we build, homes and public infrastructure, should be built in a climate adaptive manner with a building code that means that it can withstand hurricanes, earthquakes, ash fall, whatever it is. In many countries, that is not happening because building codes have not been updated. That's a legislative process that, I don't know, these legislative processes can take very long. So we have to also do the work, right, of making sure that we have systems and processes and laws and regulations in place that anything that's built has to be built to a certain standard. Right now, we don't have that. We have to get there. The second thing is, at least if you don't have that yet, the insurance gives you something that you can use to now rebuild in that climate adaptive manner. Now, that insurance costs money. I am saying that a climate compassionate approach now could look like countries like the United States, which is the world's largest polluter, but is also the world's largest overseas development assistant donor, a country like that saying, okay, your assessment is X and Y, and this is what your insurance is going to cost. I'll pay that, or I'll pay a certain portion of that based on the development assistance that I already give. And so that when it does happen, you have something. The other thing that's interesting, which this Hurricane Melissa raised, is that when the experts have to assess what is your risk and therefore your optimal insurance coverage, and therefore what is your insurance cost in terms of your premiums, they look at historical patterns of storms to determine what your risk is. Look at what Hurricane Melissa did. It pretty much stopped at one point before it got to Cayman and went like this, like a hockey stick.
Right.
And so we have a situation where the models that we use to model risk is now having to deal with an anomaly. And so it's much more difficult to determine your risk. Because it's difficult for the insurer to determine your risk, they tend to now assume higher risk than before, and therefore the premium is higher. And so the cost of insurance is only going to go up.
And will the catastrophe bond become sort of a norm?
I would imagine yes, because it proved to be effective. I mean, the other thing that countries have been doing, I think Grenada was the first to do it years ago, was to have a catastrophe clause in its bonds that it had issued on a regular basis. That's also something that you're seeing happening more and more, when countries borrow.
What we're also seeing is a hit to tourism when these things happen. A big part of the economy of many of the Caribbean destinations. You once wrote that tourism is not quite the goose that laid the golden egg. There's so much debate around that and pushback. And as a reporter, I was thinking, oh my goodness, finally, we're getting a breakdown of this. It's an issue that I've looked at so many times, but I just don't have, as you said recently, also in another piece, that the data is very lacking. Isn't this what we're seeing in Jamaica now, or is it what we're seeing in terms of tourism not being this golden goose? A lot of the all-inclusive resorts, which have the largest number of rooms and therefore bring in the most revenue, even though they don't represent, I guess, the whole hospitality market, they are the ones that have closed. Thousands of workers are now also not just perhaps have lost roofs and homes, but they're also unemployed. So is this something to think about in terms of tourism not being quite as resilient as governments would like it to be? How do you see this current situation?
Well, first of all, the hotels that have shut down, remember there are issues around having adequate food, security, water, vector-borne diseases after a hurricane passes, sanitation issues. So there's all kinds of issues as well as flights. So there are all kinds of reasons. I remember being on a board meeting and they were talking about our staff in Jamaica, and some of them can't be located. Again, we talked about people who just can't be found. You can't connect with them. Their phones are not working, etc. We still have a significant portion of the country that doesn't have electricity. I mean, how do people come out to work when they're struggling like this? So there are all kinds of reasons. I wouldn't attribute blame onto the hotels that have shut down, even if their physical property was not affected. There are many other reasons that affect a hotel's proper and responsible functioning, other than being physically intact. Now, the thing about the tourism sector, forget about, for a moment, climate crisis. Let's just deal with tourism. We've been in this region heavily dependent on tourism, and increasingly so since the 1960s, 70s, right? If this was a sector that we've been putting our hopes and future on for 50 years, 50, 60 years in some cases, and if it was such a lucrative performing sector, I would think that our countries would be much better off than they actually are. So that's the first thing. When you look at the human development indicators, when you look at countries' debt to GDP, when you look at so many other indicators of our well-being, we're not doing that well. We're really not doing that well. And so it begs the question, well, what in our economic model is working or isn't working? Which country do you know has done an economic impact study of the tourism sector? No country in the Caribbean. They like to say tourism accounts for 60% of GDP, 80% of jobs, so many thousands of people employed, so much money earned. I remember the government of Bahamas Minister of Finance making a comment some couple of years ago in the budget. We earned so many millions of dollars via tourism this year. And when you divide it by the number of arrivals, it was something like $20 a person.
Wow. What
And
about
I'm
the
thinking,
leakage? There hasn't been any study on
we haven't
leakage.
even talked about the leakage. But I'm saying to you, when they talk about these big numbers, when you divide
Right.
it by the number of arrivals, that's $20 a tourist or $30 a
Wow.
tourist.
That's
How is that?
abysmal.
It sounds nice to say so many millions. So there has never been a socioeconomic impact study, which not only looks at, which the politicians like to talk about, the positives, so much contribution
Right.
to GDP, so much contribution to jobs,
Sure.
so much contribution to fiscal numbers, so much contribution to foreign exchange. They don't look at the net. They don't look at the outflows, the leakage that you're talking about. And so an economic impact study looks not just at the inflows, but the outflows. They're not looking at the outflows. They're not looking at the outflows. Why? Because intuitively, a year ago, I was in Barbados for about a month. I could not get milk. I could not get chicken. I could not get eggs. I could not get beef in the supermarket. And
Oh.
I, asking friends, asking in chat group, what is going
Mm-hmm.
on? Well, maybe try the supermarket. You'll get some milk here. I got some beef on this one. And I have to go to all these different supermarkets. I said, you know what? What
Wow.
exactly is going on? I felt like there was a catastrophe, but I had just landed. I didn't know what was. Barbados is doing provisioning for cruise ships that are home porting there. And so they're provisioning, meaning they come and they buy
I was
supplies
going to say hotels, but
for the cruise ships. And I'm thinking, when these politicians make these decisions to do these things, do they think it through and do they ask their private sector players like the supermarket owners and so on, can you handle this pressure if I, instead of half of the supply of milk that normally goes to the supermarket, it instead goes to the cruise ship. Let's just say half. I'm just imagining
sure.
this number. What does that mean for you? They do not talk about the outflows. They talk only about, oh, well, we have 12 cruise ships that came and home ported here, and so many cruise ships visiting, so many cruise ship passengers disembarking.
For the arrivals.
What
Yeah.
what
Arrivals
is
up.
what is the
Yeah.
cost of that?
What's the cost of that? What's the cost of, people coming over? What's the environmental impact? What's none of that? Yeah.
They don't want to.
There's a lack of transparency. It's really problematic.
Because guess what? If they were to measure these things, the policymakers will be in big trouble for some of the decisions they've made. And so I did a study for Cayman earlier this year on the potential for the cruise sector for them. And it caused me to look at a wider regional cruise industry. And let me tell you, the picture is not pretty. And you have countries all over the world that are turning cruise ships away, but we're taking them. The cost to us is higher than the benefit, but they are not measuring it and they don't talk about it. So the tourism sector's fundamental problem is that it needs to measure its economic impact, its socio-economic impact more broadly. It needs to understand where these leakages are. And we know them intuitively, and we need to
Sure.
plug these leakages. And so my point is not if we should have tourism, it's how.
No.
So you have a country I talk about all the time, Bhutan. I met
Yes.
the head of their civil service a couple of weeks ago in Norway, and we talked about their tourism product. And she said, we are determined to make sure our tourism is
Yeah.
low impact, high value. Each tourist has to pay $100 a day just to be there, in addition to the other costs you have to cover. And there is also a limit on the number of tourists that they want at any time.
Yeah, I've actually reported on Bhutan, yes.
Right, carrying capacity. How many of us have done carrying capacity studies? Very few. I know of Cayman did one, and BVI did one for their baths area. So if you don't know your carrying capacity, then you're going to flood, which is why politicians get up and talk about we have to increase tourism arrivals, and we increased it last year. But what is your carrying capacity?
Yeah.
Is enough? How many is too much? And so these are the kinds of problems we have to fix. Otherwise, what we're doing is we're damaging our countries, our natural environments, our cultures in order to make this buck and generate this low wage job, by the way.
Yeah.
That is not making our countries better off, because if it was, we would all be Dubai, because we've been doing this for 50 years. They only just started. You understand?
Yeah,
Intuitive that it's
absolutely.
not working. And there are countries that do get it right. Like, I feel like Dominica has a very nice model where, except that they're now going towards cruise, which
I wrote a story about Dominica, which was probably not well received, but it was facts. they're trying to grow, but at the same time, the speed at which they're trying to grow and build
And the
is alarming.
sustainability of it.
Oh, yeah. They're building a marina in a wetlands area. I spoke to an environmental advocate group there, and they're changing the landscape forever. It's something that you can't get back, you know.
Whereas I had been congratulating them for years on having this sort of
Yeah.
very community-based tourism model, which is what you need. More local
Absolutely.
input, smaller scale, family
Yes.
run, locally owned, indigenous, all of those good things. Not anymore. Jamaica, I think, has, had quite a few of those types of operations as well.
Jamaica does have it, and this is the thing, is that tourism is so layered. And so there is a part of tourism in Jamaica that's very positive, that actually right now we're seeing even the small hotels, let's say, that are Jamaican owned or run by the same owner for years, and the amount of money they're raising for their staff also, they're putting seed money and then they're fundraising from guests, repeat guests who are invested in the destination emotionally and have connections. And the money they've raised is actually quite staggering. We're talking per hotel. I mean, obviously they're small, but they encourage this sort of responsible tourism. And if all of the Caribbean was based on that, well, we might see a different picture.
Yes, but when it's foreign owned, it's a brand that is, global. When people make bookings at those hotels, that money doesn't come on shore.
No.
All of their inputs are imported. So the local inputs are labor and, power and water, utilities. Do we really get enough out of those types of operations? Does it really stay in our country? And I have to say, just intuitively and in general, we are not getting out of the tourism sector what we deserve. And it's not because tourism is bad. Tourism is the one industry that exists everywhere on earth. Even the most isolated countries, sometimes, especially the most isolated countries, tourism is an industry that thrives. So it's not about if tourism, it's how. And I feel like, the policymakers have not done a good job of ensuring that we create a tourism sector and a tourism model that is sustainable and that truly has a measurable domestic positive impact.
I agree with you. I think there should also be some sort of climate recovery tax placed on these foreign-owned businesses that benefit from the destination. But then when there's disaster that strikes, they've got their insurance. They've got, ways to rebound.
Yeah. Well, interestingly, I just did some work in BVI. Now, most of their tourists come via pleasure craft, luxury yachts and vessels and so on. And they did this study that found that the majority of tourists, of visitors to BVI, will be willing to pay an environmental conservation fee once the government demonstrates that it is in fact using this revenue towards environmental conservation. And so that's a lesson for all of us, because I would imagine the visitors are roughly the same across the Eastern Caribbean in particular, that perhaps we need to impose an environmental conservation fee and take that money to pay for the insurance and so on that we're talking about when in fact there is some, disaster, but also some of the preventive measures that we can take are simple, like planting more mangroves and not cutting them down to build hotels. And so if you can demonstrate that you can take this fee and devote it to something that has impact measurable and impact that you can demonstrate to the tourists, then they will support it.
Belize actually has had one of those for a very long time. Mm-hmm. What would a Caribbean economy look like that doesn't rely on this sort of revenue?
Tourism revenue? Yeah, I mean, we do have examples of it. Suriname, Trinidad, Guyana to a certain, Guyana has, I think it's looking towards expanding its ecotourism sector. Bermuda and the Cayman Islands, less so. They rely more on their financial services sector than their tourism sector. The thing is, I think it's not a question of having it yes or no, black and white. I think you can make reforms to your existing tourism sector that can ensure that you get even more out of it by making sure, for example, that you have certain guidelines in place about local content, that you have certain guidelines in place in terms of foreign exchange and how that's earned and how it's spent. And so I don't necessarily see where we need to shrink our tourism sector. I think we need to each do a study, because every country is different, on what the socioeconomic impact of the sector is in each country. We need to understand what works in each country and what does not. And what does not work, we need to fix. And so I give an example. Many countries give concessions to tourism operators because you want to encourage them to come. But you give concessions, which is a cost. It doesn't appear to be a cost, but it's less fiscal revenue. And the governments talk about how much tax they earned from the tourism sector, but they don't talk about how much revenue was foregone because of the concession. So again, they don't do a net. They don't count the outflows, We're not looking at that. There must be a way, just as an example, where you can determine your net, determine if this is working for you from a fiscal standpoint. And if it is not, if you are spending more on or losing more revenue on concessions than you are earning in taxes from the tourism sector, then you adjust your tax framework to suit. It's not a all or nothing. It's not, yes, we should have it or no, we shouldn't. It's we have it. Let's make sure that it works.
After the free movement agreement came into place, Barbados and Dominica decided to sort of cross-market their tourism, and they're offering multi-destination packages, which back in the day, that's quite shocking because every island markets themselves separately, and it's quite competitive. And I thought that was very encouraging that they came together, and then maybe that's part of the change in mindset shifts.
Well, I think this again is something the CSME always envisioned. One of the reasons why I think that multi-destination type marketing, it could be very beneficial, is because it will encourage, if it's successful, higher levels of intra-regional travel, which works better for the citizens as well. I mean, so many of us talk all the time about how it's cheaper to get to Miami than it is to get from our one island to the next.
Yeah.
So if you have this multi-destination marketing, it means they must ensure that the airlift exists. And if the airlift exists and more people are using that airlift, tourists, it means it will become cheaper for us as Caribbean people. So that's also an encouraging development coming out of this free movement.
Looking at the future, what key policies do you think should be in place, or can we start thinking about for the next 20 years for economic integration in the Caribbean, or a better outlook beyond free movement?
Yeah, I think we can definitely solve more problems collectively than individually. I think our intra-regional crime, narcotics, weapons trafficking, human trafficking problem can definitely and has to be solved as a region as opposed to individual countries. Because when you solve it for one, then the problem just moves to the next weakest or more porous border, next weakest country. So it has to be resolved on a regional scale. So that's the first thing I feel like. And I know that there are some regionality to the security measures that are being taken, but I feel like we need more of that. The second thing is food security. And I know some countries have already made some strides, especially with Guyana being so large and having so much agricultural land and expertise and labor. I feel like an expansion of that would be beneficial for all of us so that we don't have to rely on imports from, this was a big thing during COVID, right? And then we went, right. Yeah. If we can rely more on each other and food from each other than from outside of the region, and also more from Latin America, because certainly Brazil, for example, and other countries in Latin America are very big on agriculture. And you also have Dominican Republic, Jamaica that also, and Belize. So that's the second thing. So security, one, food, energy. Somebody once said to me, very bright guy in the energy sector, said everything is downstream of energy. And he's right. We have countries like Suriname and Guyana that every day, almost, it seems like, are finding more and more oil and gas. And they will produce more oil and gas than Trinidad ever did at its peak. And they have much smaller populations than Trinidad. So you have these countries that have massive amounts of energy that they're sitting on that they can potentially leverage or mobilize for the rest of the region, where, by the way, in the Caribbean, some islands like Barbados, like Cayman, have some of the highest electricity costs in the world.
Yeah.
Right? And that impacts our cost of living and our cost of doing business.
Sure.
those are these three things: security, food, and energy. I would suggest there is more room for more regional cooperation.